Hi, and welcome to this week's episode of the DW podcast. I'm joined by Chris from the outside right. Thanks very much for coming on, Chris. How are you doing?
All right. How are you? Thanks for inviting me on.
Yeah, I'm all good. So for those that are listening or watching that don't know who Chris Lee is or what the outside right is, how would you describe it for those that want to know?
I guess it started as a side project really. So I was traveling a lot with work, and I realized when I was going to like Amsterdam or Brussels, I'd taken a game at like Ajax or Anderlecht or one of those sort of places, and you just it seems it's a great opportunity to get to know a country and its culture and things like that. And so I just started blogging about it in 2016, and that led to a podcast as well, and since has led to books which are they're not ground hopping related, but they are sort of football culture and history, because my degree was my dissertation was on Spanish regional identity as expressed through football. This is back in the late 90s, without giving away my age, but and that was a case study, as you can imagine, of Madrid Barca, and so that kind of just turned me on to the idea of sport and politics. And there wasn't much about it in those days. I think Simon Cooper's Football Against the Enemy had only just come out, maybe late 90s. There's a lot about it now, but it's great. It's getting a sort of a lot of academic sort of review. So that kind of led to the second book, Defiant, which we're going to talk about, I'm sure.
It's a great place to start, Chris, because one of my favourite podcasts or topics that you cover is Spain and football around the Spanish Civil War as well. And I think the thing that makes your podcast and your blog stand out is people often talk about football, they talk about the 11 players on the pitch, but you delve very deeply into the history and the origins of football clubs and the politics that motivates their fans. I live in the west of Scotland, which is a cauldron in itself, and to see the comparisons to where we are to other places and how different we are, I think supporting a provincial club, for example, like Motherwell, people often say, politics and football doesn't match, we shouldn't put them together. But when you look abroad, that's almost a recurring theme in many, many places, and Spain's probably a great one to touch on.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that, because my first book, Origin Story, which is about how the game got started, in a country-by-country guide, rough chronological order, we explore that sort of very topic in terms of when does football become political. And obviously in England and Scotland, it was more sociological than political, I suppose. So when it hits Ireland in the kind of late 1870s, early 1880s, it becomes part of the sort of national awakening, and a lot of kind of, I guess, protectionism around Gaelic games, like Gaelic football and hurling, against sort of British imports such as football, rugby, cricket, hockey, things like that. So it's kind of, that's when I guess it becomes like first football becomes political, and it's part of the national awakening as covered in that book in Uruguay, Egypt, India, Turkey, so it's and part of the national identity of Argentina, for example. It's like it's a big thing to a lot of places. We may not, in England certainly not. I guess in west of Scotland you're more tuned into the politics up there, although that is kind of, I guess, limited to a couple of derbies really, but wider than that it doesn't really exist, where it's especially Italy, which is where my book starts. Second book, Defiant.
What made you take that step then? Because you touched on with work, you were just travelling around, you were over in the Netherlands and you'd go and watch Ajax, for example. When did you think, I'm going to start documenting this? Because I suppose at first, Chris, you were doing this for yourself, and then before you know it, there's a big audience there that are thinking, we like to ground hop as well. We like to travel to different countries. There's a community, so to speak. And I'd imagine the people your podcast and get in touch have been to various countries and take advice to things that you've said as well,
Yeah, I think there is a big community of us, and there were a few people blogging and sharing things on Facebook, I guess, before. But it's, all of us probably gone to games abroad just out of interest and haven't really made a habit of it. But then I think there's two push and pull factors really. Where I live, if I go to a match, I don't go to Premier League typically, but if I did, it would cost maybe 50, 70 pounds, whatever. Difficult to get a ticket. The atmosphere isn't super amazing. It's fairly, depends where you go. Quality on the pitch obviously is like, second maybe only to Spain perhaps, but at the same time it's not I don't find the experience that different. I'm used to it, you know what I mean? So if you want to go for something different, people look for more authentic experience. I go down low in the leagues, and there's some really good cultures emerging in the UK, I think, in the sort of lower league level, but they're inspired often by Europe, in terms of the ultra scene, maybe in Europe. So we get I don't know if it's a health and safety thing or just a cultural thing or what, but there's way more atmosphere and as choreography in Italy and Germany, for example, my favorite two places to go and watch a game, because it's so accessible, it's cheap, there's always tickets available, there's always something on, especially at a night match. Brescia Brescia Ultras and a temporary stand at an incredible tifo, when we went there a few years ago. It's just you can't beat it, really, I don't think.
Just to touch on, you mentioned Italy there, and your book, for anyone that's listening, comes out in October. So when this podcast comes out, I'd imagine it'll be released 10th of October. It's called The Defiant, and it's a history of football against fascism, charting 100 years of football as a platform to oppose fascism and dictatorship in the far right. I think that's probably a really interesting topic anytime, but at the moment, especially in Italy, with the new Prime Minister coming in, it probably couldn't have come out at a better time for you.
I know, yeah. That was incredible, because I was there a couple of weeks ago, before the time we were recording, in Naples, and it was and they were talking about it then. It was, they covered the Queen was top billing for 3 days, but the election was still being covered, and that was really fascinating to see how but it didn't really surprise me at all, having read this book and known the culture of a lot of ultras, and have to be sort of taking a nuanced approach here when we talk about. I'm sure a lot of people, your listeners, will associate certain clubs with certain political persuasions. We've got to remember that most people, most fans, and I make this point right up front in the book, just go to watch a match. They're not like thinking about the politics of it. It's just their local team. They want to see them do well. But yes, there are hardcore ultra within some curva who will, in the stands at the end of the goals, who will have persuasion. And even within a curva, you can have different political persuasions. So we have to be careful not to stereotype any particular clubs. But yeah, in Italy, there does tend to be a bit of a right leaning. I shared on Twitter actually the sort of the way people, the political sort of landscape of Italy, that as per the election as it came out this week, and it was interesting to see who voted for sort of right-leaning parties and who voted for more left-leaning. And left is very much around the central belt and kind of Tuscany, and that's really interesting, because that backs up one of the sort of big sections of my first chapter on Italy, which is about why is Tuscany a quite liberal, left-leaning sort of environment. And you see a place like Livorno, which is the port city, was the birthplace of the Italian Communist Party in the early 20s, and their ultras quite famously very, very left-wing, in the Italian context, or even global context. So it's that was fascinating to see, actually. That sort of, I was like, that kind of vindicates the chapter on Tuscany that I write. So chapter on Italy, I should say.
Yeah, it's interesting you mention that. We've got some friends over in Bologna that we visit quite regularly, and go to the Curva over there, and obviously quite famously as well, left wing. And it seems like that area of Italy, Emilia-Romagna and Tuscany, it's like a red wall across the map, and the rest of it has went pretty blue.
Bologna is an interesting case in itself, because it linked to Mussolini in terms of the guy that built the stadium. Fascinating stadium. One of the great stadiums. I mean, you can't get away from Mussolini's legacy in Italian football anyway. There's at least 3 clubs in Serie A were formed deliberately to create one city club, to be really competitive in the new Serie A. So that was Napoli, AS Roma, which Lazio resisted the move to join AS Roma, which is good in a way, because it gives us one of the world's fiery derbies. But then and Fiorentina as well, which is my club over there. And you got these. But Bologna is an interesting case, because, like I said, they do have that sort of left leaning element. But in my book, I talk about I can't remember who it was. It's a Bolton or Burnley or some sort of northern team were touring just before the push in the March on Rome in October 1922, which is why quite serendipitous. I was working on this book and it came out at the same sort of time. I sort of looked at this as the sort of deadline. I wanted to get it out as a centenary of that. But they were in when Bologna fell to fascists in 1922 and it's quite interesting, their match got cancelled. But at the same time, when Mussolini fell in 1943, Bologna went into the stadium, which is now called the Renata dell'Ara, which is one of the great stadiums of Europe. And they ripped down his statue. But he's on horseback in this, and they tore down his statue, but they could only get his upper body off. So his horse and his legs were stuck there for like 4 years before they dismantled the whole rest of it. But the rest of Mussolini was pulled off by Bologna fans. So there we are.
Fascinating. It's fascinating. What when you were going about this book, what countries did you consider that maybe didn't make the cut, Chris? Because I know that chapter 2 is about Iberia, and chapter 3 is obviously about Central and Western Europe. Was there any areas that you wanted to touch on that didn't quite make the cut there?
Well, it's probably just for context for your listeners. The chapter running is basically an introduction, as in like what do we mean by like fascism and far right, and why is football so political, more than maybe other sports. You think about what's politically charged. All sports could be, but it depends on their popularity. So cricket, for example, between India and Pakistan, that's highly political because it matters a lot to both countries, people in both countries. The Olympics is always political in many ways, or can be, depending where it is. I look at Moscow 1980, Berlin 1936. But that's a sort of massive event of multi-sports. So soccer on its own is quite an interesting test case at a local level and national, international level. So cover that first. Italy, chapter 1. Iberia, chapter 2. So that's Spain and Portugal. So Franco, Salazar in particular, and then modern progressive movements. Like Rayo Vallecano, who some of your team, some of your listeners be familiar with that team. What's next? Oh yes, Central and Western Europe. So this is mostly World War II, also Nazi-occupied areas. So obviously a massive emphasis on Germany there, resistance in France and Netherlands, Czech Republic, Hungary, or Czechoslovakia as it was.
Just as you touched on Germany there, I'd imagine you maybe cover this in the book and you have done in previous podcasts. But what I find quite interesting about Germany is a lot of the countries that you've mentioned, like your Italy's and elsewhere, it tends to be that curvers are made up of, right-wing groups, or they've been infiltrated by right-wing groups, and political parties almost see that as a breeding ground for the far right if they can get in there. But a lot of the ultra groups in Germany tend to be very left-wing, even in cities where potentially their governments are centre-right. I take Bayern Munich for the example there,
Yeah, I mean, Germany is an interesting case because obviously it's been reunified, and the experience in the West is very different in the post-unification era. It's very different from the East, the former GDR. So what you mentioned there is probably accurate for much of what was Western Germany, but in former East Germany, actually, you're seeing a lot of far-right activity, which I go into. So I do, in that German chapter, I do cover progressive clubs. So I've got a great interview with Tennis Borussia, which some of your listeners might be familiar with. And then Babelsberg's another great example. And Chemie Leipzig, but they've all had kind of clashes with fans of other clubs. But all the clubs, I should say this, you're just talking about like fan groups, all the clubs themselves in Germany are very obviously aware of their own history. They are educated about it, which every country in Europe should probably learn from, to be honest, in the way they educate their people about their past. But they all have like programs to sort of to go against discrimination and educate people, etc., and don't no tolerance policies, etc. So the clubs themselves are doing the right thing, but like you said, there's an element still particularly in former East Germany. So, but anyway, just on the chapters to wrap that up. So after that is Eastern Europe, which is, is quite a difficult one to write. So Polish resistance, really, really interesting back in World War II. But then we look at the progressives, the sort of maybe lack of progressive scene in Eastern Europe. Really good stories from Croatia and Hajduk Split during World War II, and Greek resistance partisans. And then Latin America obviously has a chapter, and that's the dictatorships in Brazil, Argentina, Chile, and Uruguay. And then I finished with a chapter on Britain, which is kind of more just a bit about World War II, footballers in World War II, and then also more about the progressive clubs that, so I've got interviews with Clapton, Whitehawk, Dulwich Hamlet, and Eastbourne Town as peer pressure ultras. So it's a non-league scene, which is quite interesting. But
it's funny you mentioned that. You said earlier, the lower leagues in Britain tends to be where these groups are popping up, and you've done a great podcast and traveling around Wales and watching football there. But also, it's interesting that you finish up with these groups as well around Britain, because it seems to me that the likes of your Whitehawks or your Dulwich Hamlets, etc., from the outside looking in, and correct me if I'm wrong here, Tristan, this could be me being very ignorant towards it. I almost feel like this is harsh, right? It's almost like student groups that have popped up in these areas that are taking over the football clubs rather than the football fans. It's growing from a historical, your granddad took you or your dad took you, and that could be very unfair.
Yeah, I know what you mean. I opened the chapter. I think it was The Guardian did a piece called it like Hipster Club or something to Dulwich Hamlet, which back in 2012. I mean, I used to live near Dulwich Hamlet, so I've been there quite a few times. But to be honest, I mean,
that's not to knock it, Chris, because you look at this and you think, they're creating an atmosphere, they're building positive movements around their football club. But it's just interesting to see the dynamics there.
Well, there's a number of things. One, they say probably, bringing lots more fans and money into the club. Yeah. They're doing a lot of good work, a lot of them in their local community, which probably wasn't being done before. And I know what you mean, yes, but it's a place where people can, these are good people. These are well-intentioned people. So it's like, and the very interesting, the Clapton experience, when Clapton put created a shirt which was in the to commemorate the end of the Spanish Civil War, like 80th anniversary of it. So it was the red. So start again. Yes, red, yellow, and purple of the Second Spanish Republic, and on their shirt with the trident of the international brigades. And it's like, well, when did you ever see sort of that, on a shirt before? And it's really interesting. And so it's almost like a history lesson for whomever is interested in that shirt. Sold worldwide, did really good.
So many people in Glasgow wearing that as well, and you're thinking, people would never have heard of
it. I mean, like with any of these things, it's almost like people. I mean, I make the point in this. If you look back at the sort of the flagship club in this respect was probably FC St. Pauli for many years, decades almost. Like I guess it really took off. It started in the 80s, really took off in the 90s. I guess an international kind of cognizance, and it was. I think if you see someone in the street wearing a St. Pauli shirt, I think it's more or less them telling you something about them and how they identify ideologically, and they'll probably follow the prospects of Rayo Vallecano, Livorno, all those sort of other clubs, and they'll find a space at like Dulwich Hamlet and places like that.
Absolutely. Just to jump on your final chapter of the book as well was chapter 7, and that was a look at progressive activist football clubs as well, wasn't it? Not limited to geographies. So one of the clubs that I find very interesting is Bohemians over in Dublin. Similar to myself, a Motherwell fan, they're a fan of the club, and similar to Clapton as well. They've done a lot around their football strips. So this season they've got the Bob Marley strip that seems to be selling worldwide. Before that, they had the shirt with Refugees Welcome on it as well. What was your findings for them? Without really book, of course.
Yeah, I mean, Bohemians feature. There only like one paragraph on them at the end, because I just realised I didn't quite answer your question who I left out. But in the conclusion, I talk about other clubs from around the world, including Bohemians and like Portland Timbers and was it Standard Liège and Vålerenga, and so there's other clubs in there, but yeah, Bohemians, they seem to, I mean, it's interesting because they're one of the oldest clubs in Dublin, right? I mean, they're very long established, but they have had this recent culture, which is almost, like I said, it's more almost in that sort of St. Pauli vein, really, sort of, it's kind of reminds me a lot of it in many ways, but I guess there's obviously a space for that in Dublin, and it appeals to people because obviously they sell out all the time. So,
was there anywhere you went and you thought, I want to interview this person, and they said no, or how did you go about the process of identifying who you wanted to speak to?
Do you know what? This was all desk-based because it was written during lockdown. This is my lockdown project.
Literally, it's good to hear that. I mean, so many, don't get me wrong, lockdown brought so many tragedies for many and its own challenges, but it's good to hear, of people doing well and coming out of.
Yeah, I mean, luckily my day job is in digital marketing anyway, so I've been working remotely for more than a decade. So that was it wasn't a massive culture shift for me to do that. So kept the sort of day job going. But just on the side, the research base was pretty much like British Newspaper Archive, just doing some word search and seeing what's going on in the world. A lot of reading around those chapters. And so they grow organically when you start writing a book. My first book, Origin Stories, took 4 years, and it was sort of, or 3.5, and it kind of grew out of control. And so I'll start doing this, and maybe I should cover that country, and then it takes a whole, it's going to take weeks to research that one country. But there's a lot of, it depends where you go really, because there's a lot written already on a lot of different topics. I'd already interviewed some guests on my podcast. I've got like 200 plus podcasts going back. So I just looked back once I'd had this idea, I looked back, see what I had already on material, and just sort of asked if they were happy with me using it, and getting some quotes signed off, approved and stuff. And so, learned a lot as I went, and there are people who study like the far right in East Europe full time and as a job. So that's quite interesting. So I got a lot of interest from that. But it's like, this, like you said, in terms of timing, it was that, this isn't like a political statement on my own part at all. I'm just a historian, or part-time amateur historian who's interested in politics and sport. So I'm not making any statements, but I just thought this was quite interesting topic to cover, given how, like you said, the way things are right now.
Yeah, you couldn't have released this book at a better time, although in my opinion, it couldn't be a worse time for Italy. But it certainly seems like you brought this out at a great time when there is so much polarization in the world. And you really, from your podcast, you've really touched on that. And I think what you do quite well is there doesn't seem to be a bias narrative to any of it. You tell the stories and let people make their own conclusions. And I would imagine that the book is very similar as well.
Yeah, I just sort of the crux. You say there was a worse time. The worst time was the 1930s and 40s, but and if you're in Latin America, 70s and 80s, or 60s depending. But in terms of it's all just facts. It's all curated. It's everything's got footnotes as to where you can read more about that. It's properly like academic sort of books, everything's sourced. If anyone wants to go and read more about a topic, they can do that. It's the crux of it does happen, like I said, in that sort of like 30s, 40s if it's in Europe. A bit less so. The interesting thing about Iberia is those dictatorships didn't get involved in World War II. They were neutral, Franco and Salazar in Spain and Portugal, and they kept going till the mid 70s. So without giving my age away, Franco died not long before I was born. So it's like, this is almost living memory for, me as the writer in many ways. And Spain showed, I went to university in Spain in the 90s, so 20 something years after that sort of transition. They didn't deal with it in the same way that like South Africa did with Truth and Reconciliation. And you see this still being played out. There's a lot of polarization in Spain right now. Unlike Italy, that it is sometimes played out on the pitch, although not necessarily kind of, I'll say there's some left and right element, but I think the Madrid-Barca is such a hegemony over there. And I was saying this on another podcast recently, actually. It's like, if you look at Spain, it's almost like Madrid is the center, the club at the center. Catalonia can be, Barcelona is still seen as the Catalan kind of club. And I guess if you're a fan of another team, such as Leganés in Madrid, or Real Sociedad or Gijón, or one of those sort of other clubs, your team isn't going to win league. So you'll probably have a preference out of Madrid, Barca, who you win, and that might reflect, for some people, might reflect their politics in terms of how they feel about the Spanish nation.
I suppose this is maybe put you on the spot here, Chris, but from your findings and the people that you spoke to, is there any clubs that do this particularly well in terms of playing on their political stance, or knowing where they're positioned in their community to make positive change?
Yeah, I think you have to differentiate between clubs and the fans, right?
Yeah, I mean more so clubs, because I know it's so easy to be pushed from the terraces.
Yeah.
And as you touched on earlier, people have this view of what they think football clubs are like, but often that's the fans. But is there any clubs? I think when I think of Barcelona, I almost feel like they wear that Catalan badge with pride, and that comes from the directors and those running the football club. But I don't know if there's anyone else around the world that you've maybe found that are.
Oh yeah, I mean, well, in terms of just identity, if I take the sort of left-right element out of it, yes, Barcelona obviously been acutely aware of that, but obviously they're now, I think now compared to when I was there and they didn't have a shirt sponsor, I think now they're more a commercial rivalry with Madrid than anything else. They're very international, where before it was very inside Spain. Athletic Club in Bilbao, very obviously, as you know, they have since 1912 had that cantera policy. We have to have Basque roots to play. I think St. Pauli have done a very good job as well. They've got to be really careful about how they sort of market themselves. They don't want to sort of look like they're selling out or anything like that. But obviously, there's lots of merchandise there. I think they Tennis Borussia in Berlin are very mindful of their sort of identity. I know that also, I think who else? Rayo is different because Rayo have a conflict with their owners at the moment at the time. So the fans, yes, very left. Who else is there now? I mean, there's quite a few if you go around the world, but those are the ones that sort of stood out. Oh, Corinthians Democracy, yeah, in Corinthians in Brazil. Some of your listeners will be familiar with Corinthians Democracy, with Socrates and Walter Casagrande back in the 80s, sort of when Brazil was under dictatorship. Sort of tail end of the dictatorship. It ended in the mid 80s, but still in the early 80s, it was still quite prominent. People hadn't voted for a generation, right? So 20 odd years. And they just encouraged everyone to go out and vote, something they'd never done before. They were obviously worried about any repercussions. But no, they're just having the confidence of wearing it on a shirt and getting out, talking, spreading the word on the football pitch in Sao Paulo did the trick, got people out voting. And they, it kind of, could argue it helped, give the people confidence and bring down the sort of, dictatorship, so to speak. But even recent years, Corinthians fans have kind of resurrected that sort of vibe on the street, protesting and stuff. So
I find it fascinating that a club would do such a thing, but I think that's really important because they probably know their fans and their membership more than others, and I guess that breeds from the community that there are, maybe where they're located in a city or a country as well. And it's fascinating. The bit that you touched on there was St. Pauli becoming over commercialised as well, and that is a very fine line to tread, isn't it? Because they can't control who buys the merchandise or how many t-shirts they sell to a certain extent. But I think what they've done in recent years, which kind of shocked me, is try to do the American tours pre-season, etc. And I just think I'm not too sure about that. It doesn't sit well with me if that's the ethos of their club. But maybe I'm being harsh.
Sorry, I missed that. Which club was that? Sorry,
it's St. Pauli.
Oh, St. Pauli.
Yeah.
Yeah, I suppose they. I don't know. It's just about like straddling a fine line, really, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's really interesting because when a club goes up, I mean, one example is Union Berlin, which is not, not politically. I'm just talking in terms of culture. It's a really fun place to be. I went when they were in the second Bundesliga, and it's great. And now it's very difficult to get in. I think they only had they're expanding it, I think, but there's only 22,000 capacity in those days. But when you've got a great little ethos, a really great club, and a bit of a sort of cult following in its own right, but when they get promoted, then how do they keep that authenticity?
Yeah.
And now they're like in Europe, not Champions League, Europa League, aren't they? And so how do they keep that authenticity while being a successful commercial entity? So it's a challenge for those sort of clubs, really.
Absolutely. What's the next steps then, Chris? This is your second book, and it's just about it's just came out. What do you do next? Is there going to be a third? Is there anything?
I'm taking a break. I mean, taking a break from all this because this is just a hobby for me. The same with the podcasting. So I'm actually giving that a rest as well after this next series. I've got a concept for a third book, and I'm going to start looking into it properly next year. But they are extremely time consuming. Like I said, this was fine because it's during lockdown. But when you've got other things on, it's a bit of an effort. So I do have a concept for the third book, and it's going to be a bit of politics and ground hopping mixed, so a bit more personal, less desk based, more out in the field. Sure. But I won't be saying anything about that for a while.
That's fine. Where can people find Defiant? And if they want to go out and buy that, where can they find a bit about?
What's out on Pitch Publishing? It should be in all the sort of usual places. It's out on October 10th, and it's you can follow me online at Outside Right. That's WRITE, play on words, and that's on Instagram, Facebook, and most active probably on Twitter. Outsideright.co.uk for all the sort of the blogs and the podcasts and everything else.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Chris. It's been a pleasure chatting. Thanks to everyone who's watched or listened to this podcast. If you've enjoyed it, please go back and check out some old episodes. And please go out and check out Chris's book. Make sure that you get that and follow Outside Right on Twitter as well. Cheers, Chris. Thank you.
Thank you.